Jake Mitchell had been alone on Velos 7 for 3 years, and honestly he'd gotten used to it. His research station sat on a cliff overlooking the Crystal Valleys, a small metal box of human civilization on a world that didn't care much for visitors. The company paid him well to study the planet's ecosystem, catalog the wildlife, and most importantly, stay out of trouble. That last part was easy enough. There wasn't much trouble to get into when your nearest neighbor was a 6-day shuttle ride away. The dragons, though, those were something else entirely. Jake had watched them from day one, always through the safety of his long-range cameras and sensors. They were magnificent creatures, easily the size of small aircraft, with scales that looked like they were carved from living crystal. They hunted in the valleys, roosted in the mountain caves, and generally acted like they owned the place. Which, to be fair, they absolutely did. The company's briefing had been crystal clear about them. Observe from a distance, never approach, never provoke. Dragons were intelligent, territorial, and if you got on their bad side, well, there wouldn't be enough left of you to send home. So Jake kept his distance. He filmed them, studied their behavior patterns, wrote his reports, and went to bed each night listening to their distant calls echoing across the valleys. It was lonely work, but it was safe. Predictable. That's how he liked it. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening. Not that days of the week meant much out here, but Jake still kept track. Old habits from Earth, he supposed. The wind howled against the station's reinforced walls, and rain hammered the roof like bullets. These storms were common on Velos 7, especially during this season. Jake had sealed the outer doors, made himself dinner, and settled in with a book. Just another night in paradise. Then he heard it. A sound that cut straight through the storm, through the walls, through everything. It was deep and resonant, but there was something in it that made Jake's chest tighten. It sounded like grief. Like pure, raw anguish. He dropped his book and rushed to the monitoring station. The external cameras were fighting through the rain and darkness, but the motion sensors were going crazy. Something big had just landed right outside his main entrance. Something very, very big. Jake's hands moved quickly across the controls, switching camera views, adjusting filters. When the image finally cleared, his breath caught in his throat. A dragon. Not just any dragon, but one of the largest he'd ever seen. And she was right there, maybe 20 feet from his door. His training screamed at him to hit the emergency beacon, to seal the inner doors, to hide in the panic room. But something made him pause. The dragon wasn't attacking. She wasn't even moving aggressively. Her massive head was lowered, and in the station's floodlights, Jake could see something he'd never witnessed before. The dragon was crying. Actual tears, glowing with a soft bioluminescence, ran down her scaled face and dripped onto the ground where they shimmered in small pools. Then Jake saw what she was carrying. Cradled gently in her front claws was a smaller dragon, a cub. Even through the camera, Jake could see it was in bad shape. Its breathing looked labored, its scales lacked the shine of health, and it lay terribly still. Jake watched, frozen, as the mother dragon moved forward. She was being so careful, so gentle. She lowered the cub to the ground right at his doorstep, arranging it as tenderly as any human mother would with her sick child. Then she did something that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. She stepped back, and this massive, deadly predator, this apex creature that ruled the skies of an entire planet, bowed her head to him. To a human. To Jake. The sound she made was nothing like the territorial roars he'd recorded before. This was different. Softer, but somehow more powerful. It was a plea. A mother begging for help for her dying child. Jake had studied animal behavior for 15 years. He'd worked with creatures across a dozen worlds. But he'd never, ever seen anything like this. The dragon lifted her head, and her eyes, large and multifaceted like living gemstones, locked onto the camera. Onto him. There was intelligence there, real understanding. She knew he was watching. She knew he was human. And somehow, impossibly, she knew he might be able to help. She took another step back and waited. The storm raged around her, but she stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from crystal and hope. The message was clear. She wasn't here to threaten. She wasn't here to destroy. She was here to ask. To trust. To place her most precious thing in the world into the hands of a stranger from another world. Jake stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was impossible. This violated every protocol, every safety regulation. Dragons didn't do this. They didn't seek help from humans. They barely acknowledged human existence. But there she stood, waiting. And at his doorstep, her baby was dying. Jake stood in his decontamination chamber, watching the cub through the reinforced glass. The medical scanner had finished its work, and the results were displayed on his tablet. His stomach dropped as he read them. A crystal shard. lodged deep in the cub's chest cavity. The scanner's three-dimensional image showed it clearly, a jagged piece of what looked like the same crystalline material as the dragon's scales, embedded right next to what his database identified as the primary circulatory organ. Essentially the dragon's heart. The shard was pressing against it with every labored breath the cub took. Each pulse pushed the organ closer to the sharp edge. Jake ran the numbers again, hoping he'd made a mistake. He hadn't. The shard had to come out, and soon. But the surgery would be a nightmare. The cub's biology was only partially documented. The databases had basic information, sure, but nothing detailed enough for major surgical intervention. One wrong move, one miscalculation with the anesthesia, one slip of the scalpel, and the cub would die on his table. His hands were shaking as he pulled up the communication console. The right thing to do, the protocol thing to do, was obvious. Call headquarters. Request an emergency medical team. They had xenobiologists, specialized surgeons, equipment designed for exactly this kind of situation. They'd know what to do. Jake started typing the emergency code. His fingers hovered over the send button. Then he looked at the time estimate for emergency response. 6 days. Minimum. That's how long it would take for a ship to reach Velos 7, even on a priority run. 6 days. He pulled up the cub's vital readings again. Heart rate irregular and weakening. Respiratory distress increasing. Blood pressure dropping. Jake had seen enough medical emergencies to know what these numbers meant. The cub didn't have 6 days. It probably didn't have 6 hours. Maybe not even 3. A shadow moved outside the window, pulling his attention away from the screen. The mother dragon had shifted position. She was closer now, her massive head level with the observation window. In the station's lights, Jake could see her more clearly. Her scales, which should have been brilliant and refractive, were dulled with stress. The glowing tears still tracked down her face. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. She was watching him. Not just looking in his direction, but really watching him. Following his movements. When Jake stepped closer to the window, her gaze tracked him. When he glanced at the cub, she looked at her baby too, then back at him. There was something in those eyes that Jake had never seen in any animal before, not in all his years of xenobiology. It wasn't just intelligence. It was understanding. Recognition. She knew. Somehow, this creature knew that he was making a decision. She knew her baby was dying. And she knew that Jake was her only chance. The weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. This mother had flown through a storm, brought her dying child to a stranger from another world, and placed every shred of hope she had left in him. She could have gone to her own kind. There had to be other dragons, maybe some with healing knowledge humans didn't understand. But she'd come here. To him. What? Jake looked back at the communication console, at the unsent emergency request. 6 days. He looked at the cub, at the readings showing a life slipping away. 6 hours, maybe less. He looked at the mother dragon, still watching, still waiting, still trusting. The smart choice was obvious. Cover himself. Follow protocol. Let the experts handle it. If the cub died, it wouldn't be his fault. He'd done everything by the book. But the cub would die. There was no question about that. By the time help arrived, this little dragon would be gone, and that mother outside would be grieving over an empty nest. Jake closed the communication console without sending the message. His research station wasn't a hospital, but it had a full medical bay. Company policy required it for remote assignments. The equipment was designed for humans, sure, but Jake had adapted it before for various alien species he'd studied. Nothing as complex as surgery, but he knew his tools. He knew medicine. And he'd spent 3 years studying these dragons, learning everything he could about their biology. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for what he was about to attempt. But it was all he had. Jake moved to the medical bay and started pulling equipment. Surgical tools. Anesthesia. Monitors. His hands were still shaking, but they were moving now, following years of training. He was thinking through the procedure, mentally walking through each step, identifying the problems before they happened. The risks were enormous. He could kill the cub with the anesthesia alone. Dragon metabolism was different from anything he'd worked with. Too much and the cub would never wake up. Too little and it would wake up during surgery and the trauma would kill it just as surely. The surgery itself was even worse. He'd be working blind, adapting human surgical techniques to alien anatomy, hoping the cub's biology was similar enough to species he knew. But here was the thing, the thought that kept pushing through all his doubts. Somebody had to try. This mother had asked for help. Not demanded. Not threatened. Asked. And humans, real humans, they don't turn away from that. They don't hide behind protocols and procedures when someone's life is on the line. Jake looked one more time at the mother dragon through the window. She hadn't moved. She was still watching. Still waiting. Still believing he could save her child. He took a deep breath and began prepping the surgical bay. Protocol could wait. Rules could wait. His career could wait. Right now, right here, there was a baby dying, and Jake Mitchell was the only person in the universe who could do something about it. The first problem was getting the cub onto the surgical table without causing more damage. Jake had to move slowly, supporting the small dragon's weight carefully. Even as a baby, the creature was heavier than it looked, the crystalline scales adding unexpected mass. Every movement made the cub whimper, a sound that cut right through Jake's nerves. He kept talking softly, not knowing if it helped but doing it anyway. That's what you did with scared patients, human or otherwise. The anesthesia was guesswork. Pure, terrifying guesswork. Jake pulled up every piece of data he had on dragon metabolism, cross-referenced it with similar species from other worlds, ran calculations on his computer 3 times. The number he came up with felt wrong. Too high? Too low? There was no way to know until he administered it. If he got it wrong, the cub would die, and he'd have to walk outside and face that mother dragon knowing he'd failed her. He measured the dose, checked it twice more, and injected it. Then he waited. 60 seconds that felt like 60 hours. The cub's breathing slowed. Its small chest rose and fell more gently. The monitors showed decreasing consciousness. Jake watched the vital signs like a hawk, ready to intervene if anything went sideways. But the readings held steady. The cub was under. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. First hurdle cleared. About 100 more to go. He'd modified his surgical tools as best he could. Scalpels designed for human tissue wouldn't work on crystalline scales. Jake had adapted some of his geology equipment, tools meant for cutting and analyzing mineral samples. It felt insane using rock-cutting implements for surgery, but the dragon's biology demanded it. He tested the tools on a shed scale he'd collected months ago. They worked. Barely. The incision was the hardest part. Jake's hands were steady now, years of training overriding his fear. He cut carefully, following the scanner's guidance, creating an opening to reach the embedded shard. The cub's blood was different from anything he'd seen, slightly luminescent, thicker than human blood. It made visibility difficult. He kept clearing the area, working inch by careful inch. Outside the window, through the corner of his eye, Jake could see the mother dragon. She hadn't moved since he'd brought the cub inside. Not once. She stood in the same spot, a massive sentinel in the darkness. The storm had passed hours ago, but she remained. Watching. Waiting. Every time Jake glanced up, those eyes were there, fixed on him. It should have been unnerving. Instead, it felt like someone keeping vigil. Like she was there with him, willing him to succeed. Hours blended together. Jake's back ached. His eyes burned. He'd been standing in the same position so long his legs were going numb. But he couldn't stop. Couldn't even pause for more than a few seconds. The cub's vital signs were stable, but barely. The clock was ticking. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake could see it. The crystal shard, embedded deep in the tissue, pressing against the organ that kept this small creature alive. It was larger than the scanner had suggested, its edges sharp and irregular. Getting it out without tearing surrounding tissue would be like defusing a bomb. One wrong move, one slip, and it was over. Jake switched to smaller instruments. His hands moved with microscopic precision, carefully freeing the edges of the shard from the surrounding flesh. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He ignored it. The whole world had narrowed to this one small space, this one crucial task. Nothing else existed. The shard shifted slightly. Jake froze. The heart organ pulsed against it. He held his breath, waiting to see if he'd caused damage. The monitors held steady. He continued working, every movement deliberate, controlled. Then, finally, the last connection broke free. Jake gripped the shard with his specialized forceps and pulled. It came out slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to give up its hold. The moment it cleared the tissue, Jake dropped it into a collection tray and immediately focused on the organ beneath. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline and exhaustion making them tremble. The heart organ, exposed and vulnerable, pulsed once. Jake watched, frozen. It pulsed again. Then again. The rhythm was weak but steady. Regular. The monitor showed the heartbeat stabilizing, actually improving now that the pressure was gone. Jake worked quickly to seal the wound, using a bioadhesive compound he'd adapted for reptilian tissue. He had no idea if it would work on dragon biology, but it was the best option he had. Layer by layer, he closed the incision, checking and rechecking his work. The bleeding had stopped. The vital signs were improving. Against all odds, the surgery had worked. He applied the final seal and stepped back. His legs almost gave out. Jake caught himself on the edge of the table, breathing hard. The surgical bay spun around him. He'd been standing for 18 hours straight, his entire focus locked on keeping this small creature alive. The cub lay still on the table, its breathing steady and strong. So different from the labored gasps when it had arrived. Jake checked the monitors one more time. Everything was holding. The anesthesia would wear off soon. He stumbled to the window. Dawn was breaking over Velos 7, painting the crystal valleys in shades of gold and amber. The mother dragon was still there, exactly where she'd been all night. But something had changed. She'd moved closer to the window, close enough that Jake could see every detail of her face. She was looking past him at the table at her cub. And then it happened. The cub stirred. Its small head moved slightly. A tiny chirping sound filled the medical bay, weak but clear. Jake spun around. The cub's eyes were opening, unfocused but alive. So beautifully, impossibly alive. Jake's legs finally gave out. He slid down the wall, ending up sitting on the floor, his back against the cold metal. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him, half exhaustion, half relief, entirely genuine. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Through the window, the mother dragon's eyes blazed with light. Not just reflected light from the dawn, but something that came from within. Her scales brightened, color returning to them. If Jake didn't know better, he'd swear she was smiling. He'd saved her baby. A human, alone on an alien world, had saved a dragon's life. Recovery didn't happen overnight. Jake knew that from the start. The cub needed constant monitoring, medication schedules that Jake set alarms for throughout the day and night, and careful observation for any signs of infection or complications. What he didn't expect was how quickly his entire routine would revolve around this small dragon. The mother stayed close, just as she had during the surgery. She found a spot about 50 yards from the station, on a flat outcropping of rock that gave her a clear view of the windows. She'd leave occasionally, disappearing into the valleys to hunt, but she always came back. Sometimes Jake would wake up at 3 in the morning and look out, and there she'd be, a massive silhouette against the starlit sky, keeping watch. It should have been intimidating. A creature that size, that powerful, camping outside his door. Instead, Jake found it oddly comforting. Like having a guardian. He'd wave sometimes when he passed the window, feeling a bit silly about it. But the dragon would shift her head slightly, acknowledging him, and somehow that made it feel less crazy. The cub stayed in the medical bay for the first week. Jake had set up a heated pad to keep its body temperature stable and surrounded the area with monitoring equipment. Every few hours he'd go in to check the surgical site, change the dressings, administer medicine. At first, the cub slept most of the time, which was normal for post-surgery recovery. Jake would talk to it anyway, keeping his voice low and calm, the way he'd seen veterinarians do with nervous animals back on Earth. Then, on the 4th day, something changed. Jake walked into the medical bay for a routine check, and the cub's head lifted. Its eyes, which had been dull and unfocused, were brighter now. Alert. It looked directly at him and made a small sound, somewhere between a chirp and a trill. Jake froze mid-step, hardly daring to breathe. The cub watched him for a moment, then settled back down, apparently satisfied. After that, it happened every time. Jake would enter the room and the cub would chirp in greeting. Not in alarm or fear but recognition. Like it knew him. Like it was happy to see him. By the end of the first week, Jake started allowing the cub short periods outside the heated pad, letting it move around the medical bay under supervision. It was wobbly at first, its legs unsteady but determined. Dragons were predators, built for strength and coordination. Even injured, even young, that instinct pushed the cub to move, to explore, to recover. And it wanted Jake near. If he stepped too far away, the cub would chirp insistently until he came back. When he sat on the floor to monitor it, the cub would shuffle closer, eventually curling up against his leg. The first time it happened, Jake sat frozen, unsure what to do. Here was a creature that would grow up to be an apex predator, treating him like a trusted companion. He slowly reached out and touched the cub's scales. They were warm, smoother than he expected, with the faintest hint of the iridescent shine that would fully develop as it matured. The cub leaned into his touch. And Jake felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just a research subject anymore. This wasn't just an alien species he was studying. This was a living being that trusted him completely. The second week brought even more progress. The surgical site was healing beautifully, better than Jake had dared hope. The cub's scales were regenerating over the wound, new growth spreading from the edges. Its energy levels increased daily. It started playing, pouncing on its own tail, investigating every corner of the medical bay with intense curiosity. Jake found himself smiling constantly, documenting everything, but also just enjoying watching this small dragon discover its strength again. He taught the cub simple things almost without thinking about it. A specific sound meant food. A hand gesture meant stay. The cub learned frighteningly fast, responding to cues after just a few repetitions. Intelligence like that was rare, even among Earth's smartest animals. Jake made notes, but mostly he was just impressed. The cub also learned to be gentle with him. Its claws, even small, were sharp. Its teeth could easily break skin. But it figured out quickly that Jake was fragile compared to dragonkind. When they played, the cub would carefully control its strength, never biting too hard, never scratching. It was learning to be careful with its human friend. Finally, 2 weeks after the surgery, Jake removed the last bandage. The wound had healed completely, sealed beneath new scales that gleamed like polished gems. He ran the scanner one final time. Everything checked out. The cub was healthy, strong, ready to return to its life. Jake carried the small dragon outside for the first time since the surgery. It was mid-morning, the sun warm on his face. The mother dragon stood immediately when she saw them, her entire body tensing with anticipation. Jake walked forward slowly, feeling the cub's excitement in the way it squirmed gently in his arms. About 20 feet from the mother, he carefully set the cub down. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the cub chirped, loud and clear, and ran toward its mother on steady legs. The reunion was everything Jake had hoped for. The mother dragon lowered herself to the ground, and the cub launched itself into her embrace. She nuzzled her baby carefully, making soft rumbling sounds that Jake felt in his bones. Her scales, which had been dull for weeks, suddenly blazed with color, reflecting the sunlight in 1,000 brilliant shades. It was like watching joy made visible. Jake stepped back, giving them space, ready to return to his station. This was their moment. His job was done. The cub was home, healthy and safe. He'd done what the mother had asked of him. It was time to let them go. But the mother dragon had other plans. She gently nudged her cub to the side and turned toward Jake. He stopped walking, uncertain. She moved forward, each step deliberate and slow, until she stood directly before him. Up close, she was even more massive than he'd realized. One swipe of her claw could end him. One snap of her jaws and he'd cease to exist. Instead, she lowered her enormous head and touched her forehead to Jake's chest. The contact was gentle, careful, controlled. Then she began to hum. It was a deep sound, resonating from somewhere inside her chest, vibrating through the air and through Jake himself. It wasn't threatening. It was something else entirely. Jake stood perfectly still, tears suddenly streaming down his face. He understood. This was gratitude. This was respect. This was a mother thanking him for saving her child's life. No words were needed. The meaning was absolutely clear. Jake didn't realize he was being watched that day. He found out later, much later, that there had been other dragons in the distant peaks. They'd seen everything. The mother bringing her cub to a human. Jake working through the night to save it. The recovery period. And most importantly, that moment when the mother dragon bowed her head to him in gratitude. The mother's name, Jake learned, was Thrissa. And she wasn't just any dragon. She was a matriarch, a leader of one of the largest clans on Velos 7. What she did carried weight. When Thrissa deemed someone trustworthy, her entire clan paid attention. When she honored someone, it meant something. 3 days after the reunion, Jake was working in his lab when the sensors went crazy. Multiple large contacts approaching. His first instinct was panic, but when he pulled up the cameras he saw something incredible. 5 dragons were landing near his station, approaching slowly, non-aggressively. Thrissa was with them and so was the cub, already looking stronger and more energetic. Jake stepped outside, his heart hammering. The dragons settled in a semicircle, watching him with those intelligent, calculating eyes. Thrissa moved forward and made a series of sounds, complex vocalizations that Jake's recorder picked up. Then one of the other dragons, an older male with dark copper scales, stepped forward. He lowered his head in the same gesture Thrissa had made. A gesture of respect. That's when Jake understood. This wasn't just a thank you anymore. This was an introduction. Thrissa was vouching for him to her people. Over the following weeks, more dragons came. They didn't attack or threaten. They observed. They watched Jake go about his work. Some would bring their own young, letting the cubs play near the station while the adults kept watch. The cub, which Jake had started calling Ember because of the warm glow its scales had when it was happy, became a regular visitor. It would show up at odd hours, chirping at the door until Jake came out to say hello. Jake started documenting everything, sending detailed reports back to headquarters. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Scientists, diplomats, corporate executives, everyone wanted to know more. Dragons had been observed on a dozen worlds, always dangerous, always isolated. Nobody had ever made peaceful contact before. What Jake had stumbled into was unprecedented. The company sent a delegation. Jake was worried they'd ruin everything, showing up with weapons and demands and corporate arrogance. But to their credit, they listened to him. Jake explained how it happened. Not through force or intimidation, but through compassion. Through helping when help was needed. The delegates were smart enough to follow his lead. The dragons, for their part, were cautiously interested. Thrissa became the primary contact point, with Jake serving as the intermediary. Communication was difficult at first. Dragons didn't speak human languages, and humans couldn't replicate dragon vocalizations. But they found ways. Body language. Shared experiences. Simple exchanges of information. What emerged was fascinating. The dragons knew things about Velos 7 that human surveys had completely missed. They understood the planet's ecosystem in ways that would take humans decades to learn. Hidden mineral deposits. Weather patterns. The behavior of other dangerous species. They'd lived here for thousands of years, and that knowledge was invaluable. In return, humans offered something the dragons had never had access to: medical technology. Jake's surgery on Ember had opened their eyes to human healing capabilities. Dragons were tough, but they weren't invincible. They got sick. They got injured. Young dragons died from things that human medicine could easily treat. When Jake performed his first surgery on an adult dragon, removing a parasitic infection that would have been fatal, the dragon's attitude shifted from cautious interest to genuine partnership. It snowballed from there. Humans built a proper medical facility on Velos 7, staffed by xenobiologists and surgeons who Jake personally trained. The dragons guided human settlements away from their nesting grounds and toward areas rich in resources. Human engineers and dragon strength worked together on construction projects that would have been impossible for either species alone. Trust built slowly but steadily. Jake found himself in a position he'd never imagined. The company officially named him ambassador to the dragon clans. Not because he was a skilled diplomat or politician. He wasn't. He was just a researcher who'd made one good choice on one stormy night. But the dragons trusted him, and that trust couldn't be bought or forced. It had to be earned. Ember grew rapidly over the years. What had been a small cub became a magnificent young dragon, scales gleaming like crystal in the sunlight. But it never forgot Jake. Even as it matured, even as it learned to hunt and fly with its clan, Ember would visit the human settlement. Sometimes it would land near Jake's home and just sit there, the way a person might visit an old friend. They'd spent hours together, Jake reading or working while Ember dozed nearby, comfortable in each other's presence. Other humans arrived on Velos 7, and they'd ask Jake the same question over and over. How did this happen? How did humanity make peace with one of the most powerful species in known space? How did dragons, creatures that had killed humans on other worlds, become allies here? Jake's answer was always the same and always simple. He'd seen a mother who needed help, and he'd chosen to help her. That's all. No grand strategy. No elaborate plan. Just one human being who looked at another living creature in pain and decided to do something about it. That's what humans do best, Jake would tell them. Humans adapt. Humans innovate. Humans solve problems. But more than any of that, humans care. Even when it's risky. Even when it breaks the rules. Even when nobody's done it before. When someone needs help, humans step up. It's not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. It's about recognizing that life matters, that suffering matters, that a mother's love for her child transcends species and worlds and everything else. Jake had seen that love in Thrissa's eyes, and he'd responded to it the only way he knew how. With compassion. And that single act of compassion changed everything. Not just for Jake, not just for Thrissa and Ember, but for two entire species. Because that's the real power humans have. Not weapons or technology, but the ability to care. The choice to help. The courage to try. That's what makes humanity extraordinary.